Chapter 7. The Master's Birthday. The work of raising Smaug's treasure from the black and silty bottom of the Long Lake was not quick, nor was it easy. The water was cold, bitterly cold, not to mention deep, and each dive left Peppercorn breathless and racked with pain, his teeth chattering, his whole body shaking, his muscles benumbed and his chest burning from the effort of holding his breath. Though he was not having to raise each bucket load himself, they were drawn up on the line from the farthing above, scrabbling back to the surface and hauling himself time after time back aboard the farthing, with increasingly insensible and unresponsive limbs, the cold laying heavily across his shoulders like a wet blanket, took an almost superhuman effort. By the end of the day, having dived repeatedly throughout the day, his head was sore and he felt sick, unable to revive himself or to eat a proper evening meal. Instead, he would drag himself to his berth, where he fell immediately into a deep and heavy sleep, and dreamt of dragons and shadows and the creatures that prowled the murky waters of his sleeping imagination. Though he had not seen the dragon in mortality, attired as he would have been in muscle and sinew and flesh of scales, it was clear to Peppercorn that Smaug had been a very large, very long creature, with coils of serpentine body between front and hind legs, and more again in the way of tail behind, and imagined how the dragon would have moved in flight, spinning and weaving through the air like a kite's tail, looping and snaking fluently on the winds. Several times he had dreamed that, as he pawed in the silt of the lake's bed, rummaging blindly through the weed and sediment between the great bones that stood up like the spars of an ancient ship, the dragon was somehow quickened back to life. With a flick of its bony tail, it powered itself, snake-like, through the darkness, racing through the waters of the deep, all the time with Peppercorn penned within the skeletal jail of the dragon's rib cage, holding on for dear life to a bleachy rib. And as Peppercorn wrestled with the nocturnal dragons of his dreams, the work of cleaning, inspecting and sorting the treasures continued above decks, often by lantern light, as each day drew to its close. It was interesting to see how the attitude of the young crew changed in those first few days in relation to the treasure. Being poor street children and having never seen and certainly never owned anything so precious or valuable as rubies or emeralds, and still not entirely trusting that the old mage would be true to his word in letting them have the treasure, they were determined that they would gain some advantage from their part in the enterprise. Thus, when no one was looking, meaning Elisander, each boy took the opportunity to slip the odd stone or gold coin into a waistband or beneath the band of their hat, or else stuff it rodent-like into their cheeks to retrieve and hide it away later. And it continued in this way for the first few days, each boy growing for himself a small stash of treasure. Not that Elisander had much of a care for the treasure, nor did the boys have any reason to believe the old man might try to keep the treasure for himself. "Trinkets and baubles," he would mutter dismissively as he checked over each new haul that surfaced, spreading it across the deck of the farthing in order to get a better look. And as he examined each item in turn, each gold cloak pin and each ring and pendant, each flattened diadem and coin, and saw that they were not the item he desired, the one item he sought, he would discard them without further thought. Then, after the first few days, seeing one after another bucket load of gold and jewels come up out of the water, having more gold coins and diamonds and sapphires pass through their fingers than had brass farthings in all their lifetime put together, the boys soon became considerably more blasé about the treasure. As the barrels in the hold filled slowly but surely up, one after another, they could see there was no shortage of valuables, and they soon returned what they had taken, adding it to the barrels with the rest. They were not covetous of the treasure, these boys, nor were they particularly itchy to take possession of it. They had lived without for so long that having nothing was second nature. Still they each one liked to go betimes into the hold, unseen and unobserved, to look upon the barrels and to handle the gold and jewels. Peppercorn and his crew were a little over 2 weeks into their work of diving and collecting treasure when their fortunes and the weather both took a turn for the worst. Before leaving Laketown, Elisander had borrowed a number of oak firkins from Chubb, the landlord of the Hope and Anchor. They were the type of small barrels that carried wine from Dorwinion or ale from Southley. At the time, Peppercorn had not held out much hope of there being any truth in the old man's story, but it didn't hurt to be prepared, he supposed, and so they had loaded the barrels onto the farthing in order to store any finds they might happen upon, which is exactly what they had done once Pepper had found the dragon, allocating a barrel for diamonds, a barrel for rubies, one for sapphires and emeralds, and several for gold and silver items, sorting each bucket load that was raised between them. After the first week upon the lake, they had already filled over half those barrels that they had brought for the purpose. There had been 12 in all, and by the end of the second week they had each been filled, packed with stones and jewels, small golden trinkets and coins, not to mention a good deal of silt and rock and crustacea besides. So it was that, 14 days into their adventure, they decided they would return to Laketown. They would deposit what treasure they had already found, beg, borrow or steal some more barrels or boxes, and while they were at it, replenish their supplies. Truthfully, once it was settled, it was something of a relief to be heading home, for though they were each one of them children of the lake, with lake water in their veins and a love of being upon the water in their blood, still they had been 2 full weeks upon the Farthing and felt somewhat homesick for the city, and, if they were honest, fed up of being never any more than an arm's length distance one from the other. But as is so often the way in cases such as this, things were not going to be that easy. During the night, a northerly wind had come up off the lake and played unfettered across its black surface. Consequently, the Farthing was tossed about and rocked and rolled on the roiling water. Waves broke across her decks, cascading through the hatches into the hold and the crew's quarters, and the rain beat down in a sheet of water upon the deck and cabin roof. Everything that could move was locked away or tied down for safekeeping, while the crew remained wet and miserable in their quarters below deck. "We will sit it out," said Peppercorn resolutely, "and return to the safety of the city on the morrow, in the calm of the morning." Despite outward appearance, he was every bit as frightened as were his companions, but determined not to show it, aware of his responsibility as their leader to put on a brave face and to show fortitude in the face of danger. So that is what they did. They sat it out. And what a long night it proved to be, every second expecting to find themselves washed overboard into the churning waters, or else capsized and sinking to a watery grave. They spent most of those hours in frantic bailing, employing every vessel they could find for the job, all bending their muscles to the task, with the exception of Elisanda, who somehow remained calm and seated in the little cuddy, eyes closed as if in a trance, lips moving without sound. Peppercorn imagined the old man was enacting his magic, no doubt summoning some supernatural power to preserve them. Though how potent or effective the mage's magic, it was hard to say, for despite his unbroken efforts there was no let-up in the rain, and the wind continued to lift the water in angry peaks. Still, Peppercorn took some comfort from the mage's courage and put on a brave face in turn, for the sake of those who looked to him for leadership and reassurance. And as the rain hammered down like gravel upon the deck above them, they cowered into the darkness of the boat's belly like Eodun in the tale, who was swallowed up by a whale living in its cavernous belly for 40 days and nights. Come the morning, however, the storm had not abated, not one little bit, but raged instead throughout all the next day, deluging the Farthing with rain and tossing it about upon the billowing upsurge, making it any idea of returning to the city futile. So much as a stitch of sail would have spelt the end for the little boat and its crew, for the storm was so strong that wind and water would have overwhelmed and swallowed it up, and seen the dragon's treasure return to the depths from whence it had come. Indeed, there was no relent and no respite for those who endured it. It seemed that the lake would have its treasure restored, reclaim what had lain so long encrusted upon its bed, and forfeit the lives of all those who had orchestrated its taking in payment. By the time the second evening came, still the rain flayed the little vessel, raking the lake and scouring, no doubt, the land all about. All was in turmoil, and they were each one exhausted from fighting the constant movement of the boat, rearing and plunging in turn, the timbers of the small vessel shuddering with the brute force of the storm. Not to mention the great effort it took to secure the treasure, keeping the barrels lashed close to the side of the boat to stop them spilling their contents into the bilges, whilst all the while bailing out the water that hourly poured in. And for hour after exhausting hour they fought against both thirst and hunger, for not even Baldwin, who would fain miss a meal if it could be avoided, could think of food, so tumbled about were they below decks. And it was dark in the belly of the Farthing, for no flame could be lit, so candle and lantern both lay dormant. Though the boys of the crew did not know it was only the mage's whispered incantation that kept the Farthing afloat, and them from a very watery fate, though he could do no more to calm the storm or the lake, for that was beyond the limit of his powers. And still the Farthing kept keening and reeling, threatening to turn, to capsize and sink, dragging its crew to the lake's bed. "We cannot stay here," Peppercorn said at length, shouting over the noise of the winds. "The Farthing is not suited to such treatment. She's too small and not built to withstand these storms." "We're not so very far from Laketown," said the mage, calmer than their circumstances warranted. As if on cue, lightning flashed, snaking across the black sky, momentarily lighting up the panorama, silhouetting Laketown as little more than a smudge on the horizon, and reminding the young crew of just how far from the safety of the city they actually were. Though it was not safe to sail in such conditions, it was a good deal safer and wiser than remaining where they were, at anchor upon the increasingly agitated lake. So it was decided they would not weather another night, nor await the coming of the morning to make their return, lest they should be sunk before it arrived. Instead, Peppercorn commanded that the anchor be raised, leaving the bladder and line in place so they could return on the morrow, and so began a very rough and very choppy passage back to the city. "It's back!" called Nicholl suddenly, shouting above the noise of the wind and the waves, pointing to the southern distance. Sure enough, there upon the billowing horizon, rising and falling with the swell of the lake, was the black sail, as menacing as ill fate, outlined against the inky sky. Still, there was nothing could be done about it now. They had more pressing things to be worrying about, and Peppercorn didn't doubt that whoever was piloting the black-sailed boat was having as rough a time of it as were they, and was as keen to return to some safe harbour too. It was a long and perilous journey back to the city, longer by far than the distance alone would warrant, for though the north winds drove them southward, still the Farthing went whithersoever she would, and tiller and rudder were only partially effectual in countering the effects of wind and wave. In truth, it was a journey that they would be very happy to forget, and certainly rather not repeat. And so it continued, hour after terrifying hour throughout the long night, at times furling the sail lest the Farthing be turned over, at times setting the sail to harness the winds that would drive them back to Laketown and to safety. But every storm runs short of breath eventually, or so the missus was fond of saying, and as sure as every night is followed by the day, the rain stopped falling, the winds relented, and the lake gradually settled. It was several hours past dawn that the Farthing arrived back at Laketown, storm-lashed and buffeted, an hour or so after the fishing fleet would ordinarily have departed for the fishing waters. It was one of those rare occasions when setting out upon the black waters had been judged too dangerous, and the fleet remained still at the wharves, awaiting calmer conditions. Though the storm had abated, the clouds looked to have descended the sky and settled upon the city in a shroud of thick fog that hung pale and spectral above the surface of the water. If the boat with the black sail had followed them back to the city, there was no knowing now, for everything was swallowed up in the fog. Only the odd faint light could be seen to penetrate the mist, one such light glowering upon the postern as they passed silently by. That will be Scoggins, Peppercorn thought, seeing the bright glow of a brazier at the end of the harbour, northward toward the troll gate. He'll have sat there all night keeping watch over the fishing boats, he thought, imagining the dutiful old man wrapped in his oilcloth, and he peered into the darkness to see if he could make out anything more as they sailed past. It had been decided that the safest place for them to unload and store their cargo was with the skipper at his warehouse in the postern, but gaining entry to Laketown of a night time was not such an easy thing. Finding an empty mooring space at the postern where they could tie up the Farthing would not prove so difficult, but getting through the Troll Gate or the Seine Gates, certainly if you hoped to do it without a run-in with the watch, was another thing altogether. Likewise the Felon's Gate and the Sinistral, while entry after dark to the haven was impossible, for the master's daughter, the great iron portcullis that gave or barred entry to the ports of the Sunstrig, would be closed and secured at this late hour. And though the watch could be roused and entrance gained at any of the city gates, if a coin or two were to grease the right palm, their arrival would in no wise go unnoticed by the provostmen. You did not simply come and go as you pleased from the harbours of Laketown. For that reason, Peppercorn had given it much thought. It did not look like so very much, their haul of precious treasures. 1,000 years at the bottom of the lake had left each piece tarnished and encrusted with barnacles, sometimes beyond recognition. All the same, he did not wish to risk having the provostmen root through it. Though they were not the cleverest of individuals, once they realised what it was that the Farthing carried in the 12 barrels lashed down in her hold, that it was not their usual netful of fish, at best the treasure would be taxed, at worst it would all be taken, and their work of the last week would have been for naught, not to mention the loss of their considerable hopes and dreams. Truth was, Peppercorn and his crew were poor, and had always been poor, with no hope or expectation that it would ever be otherwise. Not until the mage had come, that is. Now all that had changed. Now the future looked immeasurably brighter and more hopeful than it had ever looked, and none of them wanted to risk that newfound hope on the whim of the provostmen, who, next to the master himself, were the greediest creatures this side of the misty mountains. With this thought uppermost in his mind, Peppercorn instructed that they give the postern a wide berth, and passed right by the city, coming instead upon its southern side. Here they steered landward beyond the wall of the haven, toward the sally port, where Peppercorn knew of an existence of an alternative landing. It was not a secret landing, at least that's what those who had used it in the past for smuggling activities might have claimed, feigning innocence. No, it was private, that was all, discreet, out of sight of prying eyes, you might say. Indeed, for those who were willing to pay for the pleasure, there were several such landings concealed within the walls of Laketown. For a small fee, Peppercorn knew, they would come into the city this way without being seen by the authorities, and more importantly, without having to answer any questions about what exactly was their business, arriving as they were so late to Laketown, and what it was that they carried in their hold. This particular landing was called the Covert, by those who called it anything at all, and it was managed by a man named Shillabear, a notorious smuggler and privateer who had avoided imprisonment only by greasing the palms of the right hands, so to speak. Peppercorn had crewed for Shillabear on a couple of occasions, as had the other boys, Needs must when the devil rides, the missus had been wont to say. And while he wasn't exactly on good terms with the smuggler, Peppercorn felt certain that they could safely gain entry at the covert for the payment of a small donation of coin. As they approached the high palisade that ran around the extremities of the city, Peppercorn ordered the sail furled and all lanterns extinguished so as not to draw the attention of any watchmen who might be upon the wall. They continued skirting around the city in silence, but for the lapping of the water upon the hull and the rhythmic dip of the two great oars whereby Baldwin and Cresson brought her smoothly toward the landing place. There was only a small pier beside the covert gate, enough to berth a single vessel, and only a small one at that. No beacon or lantern marked the end of the pier, no light guided travellers to the safety of the mooring, and it took a skillful pilot to find it in the dead of night, with a thick fog making everything harder to see. Still, Peppercorn knew its whereabouts and brought them directly to it. As they came alongside the darkened mooring, with a nod from Peppercorn, Black Nickel leapt from the prow onto the small platform and tied them off to a standing post. Peppercorn, Elisander and the rest of the crew remained silently upon deck, watching as Nickel bounded up a small, narrow flight of wooden steps and disappeared into the shadow and mist of the night beyond. From the darkness there came the almost imperceptible sound of a bell being oh so gently rung, and answered in turn with a hushed voice. A crack of light opened above them, a door, Peppercorn thought, but before anything more could be seen, the crack closed again, tight against the night and prying eyes. In no time, Nickel returned, untied the painter, and leapt back aboard. Shillabeer said yes, said Nickel, answering the question that no one had asked but all were thinking, and his affirmation was followed by the sound of a wooden bar being lifted, and a small section of the city wall swung slowly and smoothly open. Taking to the oars again, Baldwin and Cresson rowed the farthing gently forward, while Peppercorn steered her carefully into the narrow breach. Once safely through, the gate closed once more behind them, shutting out the dark expanse of the lake and enshrouding them in the close embrace of the city. Here they found themselves in a narrow channel of water, with walkways and tall warehouses that hemmed them in on either side, buildings so tall and straight that no moonlight here, nor any stray starlight penetrated the night shroud. The channel was not broad enough to accommodate the oars, and so Baldwin propelled the little boat forward with a long pole instead, which he punted into the mud of the lake's bottom, pushing them silently forward. All was quiet, all was still. Suddenly, a single light appeared on the catwalk above them, flaring bright in the darkness, and a bulky figure stood silhouetted beside it. Then a second and a third light joined it, each one a dark figure with flickering torch, outlined at intervals along the walkway, some to their left, some to their right. Ugly, hard-looking faces, scarred and grizzled, made all the worse by the sickly light, peered down upon the little boat and its crew. Indeed, it would seem that, when all the rest of Laketown slept, here at the covert it was as busy as if it were midday. These were Shillabeer's men, Peppercorn knew. Coarse, violent, dangerous men. They did not move, nor did they speak, but simply grimaced from their vantage point high above the water, looming over them in a decidedly menacing way, casting their light upon the black water and upon the farthing as she scudded through it. And in each man's hand, indicated by the odd reflected glint of light, a knife or a sword or an axe or some other bladed weapon, which greatly added to the boy's sense of unease. Though it was a little too late for reproach, Peppercorn found himself wondering whether this had been the wisest way to enter the city after all. Moreover, he began to wish they were anywhere but here, in the heart of Shillabeer's realm, under the heavy gaze of his crew, helpless to escape. Under the circumstances, a run-in with the watch at the postern now seemed far preferable. If only they knew what we carried, Peppercorn mused fretfully as they moved slowly forward along the channel. He gazed nervously upward at the looming thugs and then thought of the 12 precious barrels in the hold, each one filled with the dragon's golden jewels. Such villains as these would not hesitate, no, nor give a second thought to cutting their throats, sinking them in the lake and taking their cargo for themselves. Who would? Such a treasure would make its owner rich beyond imagination, and they were but orphans. No one would miss them, no one would care if they disappeared and were never seen again. The master would probably commend them for such a service. Passing along the channel with its gallery of rogues and cutthroats seemed to take longer than the distance warranted, and Peppercorn was relieved when they finally reached the end, and they came at last to another gate, on the other side of which they knew they would enter the quiet safety of the sleeping city. But they were not home free yet, for there, beside the gate, stood a single dark figure awaiting their arrival. He stood before them as they approached, a large, imposing presence, more of a barrier or so it felt to Peppercorn than the wooden gate itself. His pock-marked face, pink and fleshy, was expressionless, fixed in a hard stare that glowered in the darkness. Torchlight glistened upon the dome of his bald pate and the arc of his hook nose, and he stood with his boots planted firmly, and it seemed to the boys immovably, upon the landing, where the mist coiled eerily about his feet. As they drew closer, he extended a huge hand, its grubby palm turned uppermost. This, Peppercorn knew, was Cutter, a butcher and a slaughterman who had an abattoir near Pence Lock. There he filled the air with the stench of death and sluiced blood and filth into the lake at the end of each day, where the gulls who had bickered over the leavings of the fishing boats continued their squabbling over the offal and offcuts of the butcher. There too he met betimes with other criminal sorts to buy, sell, cheat and extort whatever he could turn a profit on. Oh yes, Peppercorn knew Cutter's reputation all right. He had seen him before and heard of his exploits. He was Shillabeer's stooge, his right-hand man, his fixer. It was his job to oversee Shillabeer's interests, to conduct his business and to silence any whose loose tongue might put it at risk. Cutter could not be trusted, that much Peppercorn knew for certain. He was a cheat and a thief, and he did not doubt a murderer too. If he knew what treasures lay in their hold, he would kill them all to have it for himself. Cutter did not speak, nor did he need to, for the menace of his presence said quite enough, not to mention the eloquence of the large cleaver that hung from his thick belt. And so they stood like this for some time, Peppercorn on the deck of the Farthing and Cutter on the dark landing, his open hand held out before him, each one observing the other, each one weighing up the other, each one trying to read the other's face and discern their thoughts. It was Nickel who finally broke the deadlock. "You must pay him, Pep," the boy whispered, leaning in close to Peppercorn and nudging him into action. "A silver florin," he nodded. "That's what was agreed." "Oh, yes, of course," stammered Peppercorn, as if emerging from a waking dream and breaking free of the butcher's gaze. He took the small coin that Elisandra had given him and moved toward the gunwales and Cutter's outstretched hand. As he drew closer, Peppercorn was overcome by a strong and pleasant smell, sharp and metallic, mixed with the stench of the big man's sweat. It was the smell of blood, Peppercorn knew, and it seemed to cling to Cutter like a barnacle to a rock. Wishing to get their business over with as quickly as possible, Peppercorn reached over to place the florin into Cutter's open hand. Quick as a flash, and before Peppercorn could withdraw his hand, Cutter grabbed him about the wrist and held him firmly where he stood, leaning awkwardly over the gunwale of the boat so that he almost toppled forward. Cutter narrowed his eyes suspiciously, a drop of sweat making its way along the arch of his beak-like nose. Then, lifting the coin to his mouth, the big man first bit down on it with blackened teeth until, satisfied with its authenticity, he dropped it into a pouch at his belt. Still he did not take his eyes from Peppercorn's, still he did not lose his iron grip upon Peppercorn's wrist, and still he did not move. Once more Peppercorn felt as captivated by Cutter's dark, lifeless stare as by the huge snare of a hand that held him, fixed to the spot. "I wonder," Cutter said at last, speaking for the first time, his voice rasping against the night's silence like fingernails on stone. "What is it that you have tucked away in this little boat of yourn?" And his eyes seemed to bore with increased intent into Peppercorn's own, as if searching there for the answer to his question. "What's worth paying Shillabeer a silver piece to smuggle into this stinking place?" He knows, Peppercorn thought, and panic rose instantly like bile in his throat. Seeing the direction in which things were quickly turning, the other boys had already begun to look about themselves for whatever lay to hand, anything that they might employ as a weapon should the need arise. A hooked gaff, a length of knotted rope, a broomstave, a wooden bucket, the heavy cast-iron pan on the firebox. Baldwin drew the filleting knife that hung from his belt, holding it tightly in his clenched fist, and though the blade was long and thin and sharp as a needle, still it looked but a toy compared to Cutter's massive cleaver. With each passing second, it seemed certain that a physical confrontation of some sort was an inevitable and unavoidable conclusion to this business, and if so, it would not end well for the boys of the Farthing. "Suppose you show me what you got in that hold of yourn," Cutter growled, and he drew Peppercorn closer still, pulling him off balance and causing him to steady himself upon the gunwales. They were so close now that all that stood between them was the side of the boat, so close that the tips of their noses almost touched, and the stench of the butcher's warm breath was strong in Peppercorn's nostrils. With his free hand, Cutter reached for the cleaver at his belt, sweat running down the glistening dome of his bald pink head. "Come on," he barked, giving Peppercorn a little shake. "Don't let's be coy now." And he brought the huge cleaver down with a sudden thud into the Farthing's gunwales, where it bit deep into the timber. By now 2 other men had joined Cutter on the landing. Two equally unsavoury looking characters, one dressed like a fisherman in an oilcloth cape with a hood that came down over his eyes, leaving just a bristly chin showing. The other, a huge bearded man with a chest like a barrel and a flaming torch. Both were armed with long, sharp knives, and the man with the torch gave a low and sadistic laugh to see the fear upon Peppercorn's face, and how Cutter held him fast, shaking him as if he were but a rag doll. It was at this point, when it looked like things were going to take a turn for the worse, that Elisander stepped from out the shadows of the galley, where he had been watching events unfold. He walked briskly forward, toward the front of the boat where Cutter now stood nose to nose with Peppercorn, their eyes still locked together. Startled of a sudden by the unexpected appearance of the mage, the butcher released Peppercorn's wrist, sending him stumbling backwards. Wrenching the cleaver free of the splintered wood, Cutter snatched the torch from his companion and held it up in order to better see who it was that had been concealed with his time in the shadows. "What's all this then?" Cutter growled uneasily, waving the giant cleaver at Elisander. "Who in Hanor's name are you?" Elisander continued forward, his face all o'ershadowed by the wide brim of his tall hat, toward where Peppercorn now recovered his composure in the prow, and as he did so, he seemed to straighten and to grow in stature, while in equal measure Cutter retreated, shrinking away from the advancing mage. He had thought this little boat crewed only by children, and had not expected to find a grown man aboard. But Cutter was not cowed for long, and seeing that it was just one man, and an old one at that, unarmed but for a gnarled staff, his confidence quickly returned, for what was an old man after all, that he should be afraid of him? Brandishing the cleaver above his bald head, Cutter moved once more toward the farthing, and in a single bound jumped heavily aboard, setting everything to rocking and swaying. Though the boys instinctively fell back a step or two before the butcher's advance, Elisander did not. He did not move, in fact, but remained where he was, and for a moment the boys of the farthing feared that they were about to witness the old man's death. As Cutter paused for a moment, cleaver in hand, paused for a split second to consider his next course of action, Elisander raised up his staff in both hands, and whispering a word or two under his breath, he brought it down hard, striking the tip upon the deck with a thump. Instantly the head of the staff burst into flame, casting beams of unnaturally bright light around the covert, filling it and lighting it as if in broad daylight, making vain the many torches of Shillabeer's henchmen. Cutter turned his face away from the light, shielding momentarily his eyes from its sudden brightness. At the same time the big bearded man came forward and made as if to leap aboard to join Cutter in his attack of the old man. "Back!" Elisander commanded, turning to the bearded man. "Back, you vile and cankerous wretch!" And he held up a hand before the man's hoary face, as if his hand were an impenetrable shield that could not be breached or passed. It sounded to those upon the farthing as if the old man's voice had issued from somewhere outside of him, somewhere beyond his person, as if from the walls of the surrounding buildings perhaps, or from out of the fog upon the water, or from the very skies above them. Wherever the voice had come from, it seemed loud enough to wake the whole city, and yet his words were not loud. But still they had come with an irresistible force, and Peppercorn was not alone in feeling a strong, almost overpowering urge to obey his will, to perform whatever thing the mage commanded, even though the words were not directed at him. The spell, for that is exactly what it was, clearly had the same effect upon the bearded man, for he stopped dead in his tracks, as if he had come against a stone wall, and he dropped the long knife he had been clutching to the wooden boards of the landing, where it stuck with a thud. Turning back to the butcher, Elisander continued, "Do not hinder these good souls." His eyes were wide and bright in the reflected light that emanated still from his staff, and his voice continued to resonate deep and commanding, turning about the covert like starlings in flight. "Remove yourself from this vessel," Elisander commanded. "Open wide your gates and let them freely pass." Without a word to the contrary, Cutter jumped back down to the landing, and taking the hooded man roughly by the scruff of his collar, he growled a command that he should "open these here gates and make it snappy, or I shall fillet ye like a kipper." And the hooded man and the bearded man snapped to it like scolded curs, pulling purposefully at the ropes that raised the gate as if their lives depended upon it. Without command or charge, Elisander's fire went out as suddenly as it had come, retreating into the head of the staff like water tumbling down a drain, and the night time rushed back into the passageway of the covert, enveloping and enshrouding them once more in darkness. The mage looked once more like his old self. Peppercorn was astonished. He could not understand what had just happened. He knew these people, Shillabeer and his men, knew their savage and brutal ways, had grown up around them, and done all he could to avoid them wherever possible. This encounter should have ended with Elisander dead, gutted like a pig. Cutter was equal to the job and had performed it many times before, Peppercorn did not doubt. And yet here they were, alive to tell the story. There was only one answer that made sense. It was magic, no question about it. He would ask Elisander later, Peppercorn resolved, once they were away from this place, when they had a chance to speak, and the mage would demur and deny, Peppercorn knew, for he was learning this was Elisander's way, to insist that it was no great deal, that it had been nothing worth noting or mentioning. But Peppercorn was determined, and would press the old man and learn a little more of the power that he had exercised. But no time for such things now. As the gate swung open before them, Peppercorn sprung into action. "Quick," he snapped, making his way back to the tiller. "Get that pole moving and let's get out of here." Baldwin did not need telling twice, and soon he was plying the long pole and pushing them once more through the water. How relieved they were once they slid out of the covert and onto the tower wharf that lay beyond, to hear the gates close behind them. Though Peppercorn had taken the opportunity, as they slid past, to lean out and snatch up the dagger that the bearded man had dropped upon the landing. They had clearly all had a very narrow escape, and some time passed gliding through the silent city before any of them were able to breathe any easier or dared to speak. Beyond the gate of Shillabeer's yard, the city still slept. Peppercorn allowed them a single lantern, which they hung low on the prow to light their way, and in this manner did they navigate the silent city and the criss-cross of canals and channels. Though the Farthing was wider than many of the wherries and rowboats that traversed the waterways of Laketown, it was not much bigger and was easily accommodated upon the main thoroughfares, especially now when there was no other traffic upon the waters. Silently they slipped through the dark city, cleaving the black water, Baldwin's pole dipping industriously in and out of the lake. Here and there cat's eyes reflected back from deep doorways from whence they observed their silent passing. Though the nighttime streets and waterways were quiet and calm enough, the lake's surface now flat and peaceful, signs of the storm's brutality were evident wherever they went. Window shutters hung loose upon their hinges. Pots, boxes, barrels and crates lay scattered across landings, and roof shingles floated in places in the water. Shop signs, tables and benches were betimes torn down or overturned. When they spoke of it the next day, many told them of how the lake had risen up in tall peaks, mountainous waves crashing against the city walls and across the decks of the moored ships that fought against their hawsers to be free. Of how the lake waters covered over the lowest towpaths and wharves and seeped beneath doors and gates to flood those buildings upon the lowest levels. During their long journey home, they had decided that if they made it back alive, they would tarry in Laketown for what remained of the night, and only as much of the next day as would give them time to secure the treasure barrels safely out of harm's way and to acquire some replacements. Peppercorn would drop in on Halfpenny to see her pretty smile and to pay Nodnell the money which, the tailor would no doubt later remind him, was now past due, and see that some food made its way to Pabby. Once these duties was discharged, they would return again to the lake, to the site of the dragon's watery grave and his treasure. Now, after their close shave at the covert, the necessity of getting the treasure safely stored out of harm's way seemed more pressing than ever. None of them felt comfortable to be moving so openly about the city with the treasure still in the hull, and would all feel a lot happier and a deal less anxious if the barrels were secured in the skipper's storeroom as soon as possible. But it was not going to be as simple as that. "I've been thinking," Peppercorn announced after some moments of quiet sculling. "I'm not sure it's best that we go right away to the roost, for it seems now the most obvious place for us to hide the treasure." They all knew what he meant. Not only was the roost the most obvious place for Peppercorn to seek sanctuary, it was the only place, for he had no other benefactor in the city who either had the room for 12 barrels of treasure and sea debris, or, more importantly, who he trusted. At this late hour, when night was at odds with morning, the roost, they all knew, would be closed up tight, its doors locked and barred, its gateways fastened and windows shuttered, its occupants tucked up soundly in bed. That being the case, they would not rouse anyone without drawing all kinds of attention to themselves, including from the watch and maybe even the provostman. Moreover, the roost had no secure mooring, and so they would have to tie the Farthing at the public wharves outside the skipper's gates, and then carry each of the barrels one at a time across the landing and the yard and into the holding shed, where anyone who cared to could observe them about their business. They would need torchlight to achieve this, and there would be keys rattled in locks and chains jangled, and they were sure to be seen by someone who they would rather not be seen by. All things considered, they may as well bang a drum and announce their whereabouts from the top of the naysayer's tower. So it was agreed. They would not go yet to the roost, but would go instead, for what little remained of the night, to the Moon in the Water public house and hostelry. This particular establishment was situated in the weft, a little closer than Peppercorn would have liked, not only to the garrisons of the master's housecarls, but also to the armoury, the chancellor's private household, and the provost's own apartments. There was, however, a significant benefit to the Moon in the Water. At the time of its building, it had been constructed upon a series of wooden stilts that raised its lowest level just over the height of a man above the lake's surface, giving it an undercroft and creating a covered mooring space for its patrons. This mooring was accessed via a low opening, so could not be entered by vessels with tall masts or multiple decks, but was perfect for coracles and smaller boats such as the Farthing was. And so Peppercorn had them lower their mast, unhitch the chain that hung across from one post of the entrance to the other, and they slipped unseen and unnoticed into the undercroft beneath the inn. It was, of course, dark beneath the moon in the water. That being said, it was not entirely unlit, for a small lantern still burned atop a flight of steps beside the door which was entrance to the inn. On arrival, Nickel leapt lightly from the prow to the landing and drew the Farthing into the mooring. There was a number of small vessels already tied up there, but they found space enough without difficulty, and Nickel tied their painter to a hitching post. Baldwin was wet with sweat from the exertion of punting them from the covert to the weft, and was glad to be able to finally lay down his pole. In the light of their newfound wealth, they could easily afford the luxury of separate rooms, one for each of them, with wall hangings to keep out the draughts, and a small, well-stocked hearth and a feather bed apiece, if indeed the moon in the water had such facilities available. That being said, none of the boys wished to sleep alone, having never done so for as long as any of them could remember. "I doubt I could sleep a wink," explained Cresson, "without Baldwin snoring to soothe me." So they laughed sleepily and agreed that they would be happier with a dormitory room, with a number of beds in which they could all be together for what remained of the night. Peppercorn, however, refused the comfort of a real bed, insisting on staying instead aboard the Farthing. He was its captain after all, and it was his responsibility. Whether or no some nocturnal burglar who stumbled upon the barrels in their holds would recognise their contents for what it actually was, begrimed and befouled as it was neither here nor there. They had come too far, and come so tantalisingly close to improving their wretched lot to risk it all now. "A good idea," agreed Elisander, hearing Peppercorn's resolve, "and I will remain here with you. There is much still you need to know, and it will give us time to talk. Alone." The other boys were not sure how they felt about this last remark, about Elisander and Peppercorn keeping secrets from them, but they all knew exactly how they felt about the prospect of a good night's rest in a real bed, and their tiredness soon overruled their hurt feelings. They made their way up the stairway, drawn like moths to the lantern that hung beside the door, and rang the bell for the night porter, who at length granted them admittance. Peppercorn experienced a moment of regret, seeing his friends filing into the warmth and light of the inn, and for a moment second-guessed his decision not to join them, for it did indeed look a welcoming sight. As quick as it had opened, the door at the top of the stairs closed once more behind them, and the sound of a bolt being drawn put pay to any misgivings that may momentarily have beset him. Extinguishing the boat's lantern, Peppercorn lit instead a single candle that smelt of tallow and was already halfway burned down to a puddle in a pewter candlestick. He and Elisander then sat, huddled upon stools about the small round table in the little captain's cuddy, but not before Peppercorn had locked tight the hatch that led below decks where the barrels were stored, having first affixed a line from the hatch to the galley bell that would ring to alert them should anyone try to gain entry. For the first few minutes they sat in silence, the only sound being the almost imperceptible lapping of the gently undulating water, and gave their full and undivided attention to the very serious matter of filling and priming their pipes. A taper was then touched to the candle, which both mage and boy employed to light said pipes, and in very little time exultant plumes of smoke were blown gratifyingly into the darkness. "I've been thinking," said Peppercorn at last, in a tone of implied wisdom, "perhaps we should give up on whatever treasure remains in the dragon's grave, cut our losses, so to speak, and content ourselves with the treasure we already have. Why be greedy and risk it all?" "A noble compromise," said Elisander casually, his bushy brows o'ershadowing his black eyes and hiding from Peppercorn whatever expression played upon them. "But you forget, you have not yet fulfilled your contract. Your services were engaged in order to retrieve the talisman, not the treasure. Only then, once the talisman is safely in my keeping, will you receive your reward." "Oh," replied Peppercorn flatly, remembering that this was indeed their arrangement. The young captain fell silent once more, and several more minutes of quiet smoking then passed before he summoned the courage to address a topic that he had not mentioned during all their time upon the lake, but that was weighing upon his mind now more than ever. "There is something I have been meaning to ask you, Elisander," he began, not coming too quickly to the point. "Something that I believe will have great bearing upon our work together." "And what is that?" replied the old man, smiling at the boy's serious tone. "Come now, don't be shy, ask your question, I shan't bite." And he chewed upon the stem of his pipe to hide his amusement. "Well, do you recall that night at the Hope and Anchor?" Peppercorn continued. "You said that you were not a wizard. Do you remember?" Yes, I remember, and yes, I did. You're quite right," the mage replied. "And so, I was just wondering, do you still say you are not a wizard?" "Most emphatically," Elisander replied. "And yet," Peppercorn meandered, "I would suggest that recent events would seem to belie that claim and confirm what we had in fact originally been told by old Mother Peg, that you are indeed a wizard." And he blew out a long plume of smoke, as if it settled his argument and proved his point. And by recent events, I suppose you mean that unhappy business with the ruffians back at the covert, do you? Elisanda asked. Well, yes, agreed Peppercorn. The whole fire from your staff thing, the booming voice, the open your gates and let them pass. And here he did an impression of the old man. Quite so, chuckled the mage. But that is not all, insisted Peppercorn. There were the plates and tankards and whatnot that floated up from the table that night at the Hope and Anchor. I was right there, remember? I saw you do it. I meant you to see me do it, said the mage matter-of-factly. Indeed, it was done for your benefit. I was trying to get you to believe in me, if you recall. OK, and what about the sapphire that you mysteriously found in the belly of that fish? Peppercorn paused for a moment to let his point hit home. And I saw what you did during the storm, too. You used magic to save us. By rights, that storm should have swallowed us up, and even now we would be at the bottom of the lake. OK, agreed the mage, holding up a hand. I see I have something of a case to answer, so I will try to explain. He sniffed and rubbed his nose and cleared his throat, as if trying to decide where best to begin. It is true, I suppose, that some people have called me wizard, which, as I have explained, I am not. Others call me a mage, but it is a title I do not much care for. It is crude and somewhat inaccurate, but I suppose for those with but a rudimentary understanding of things, it comes somewhere close to the mark. So you are not a wizard, the boy clarified, still a little unsure, but you are a mage. He sounded about as sure as a bowman trying to hit a target in the dark. Tell me, Peppercorn, what is your understanding of the role of a mage? Well, it's someone who, well, and he let out a long sigh. Well, I don't actually know, he admitted, but it's something to do with magic, I'm sure of that much. And that, exclaimed Elisanda triumphantly, is exactly why I object to the title, for a mage is neither one thing or the other. It is a catch-all for anything remotely to do with magic, and is likely to be levelled at a conjurer at a pageant as at one of the great wizards of old. And it is not only mage or wizard, mark you, that men call me, no. Some say I am a prophet, some a seer, others call me a necromancer. Many have called me an enticer or a rogue, and those who do not believe in my craft, they call me charlatan and trickster, though thankfully rarely to my face or within my hearing. And he puffed earnestly at his pipe. I am very sorry, Peppercorn, he continued at length, but though people call me mage, and I admit, not without good reason, I am no wizard. Would that I were. Even at the height of their power, there were but too few of their order. No, the blood of the Astari does not flow through my veins. He puffed thoughtfully upon the long stem of his pipe and continued through a plume of fragrant smoke. Nevertheless, I am a devoted student of their wisdom and their ways. But if you are not a wizard, insisted Peppercorn, how then do you do the things you do? I only said I was not a wizard, replied the old man. I did not say there was no such thing as magic. And pausing, he drew once more upon his pipe, the tiny bowl of which glowed and crackled, casting upon his face an eerie red glow. I know some small magic, it is true, though nothing of any great consequence, he explained, waving his hand dismissively. Not yet, at any rate, he added, a little cryptically, Peppercorn thought. I have some skill in the arts of enchantment, as you have seen yourself, a handful of minor illusions and parlour tricks for the most part. What's more, I have learned the power to enthrall, to beguile the weak mind to my will. It is no great thing, once you know the trick of it. That much you saw at the covert. Cutter should have killed you, insisted Peppercorn, but you commanded him as if he were a pup. And let's not forget how you made fire come from out your staff. Ah, that, said Elisanda, sounding suddenly more serious. Yes, I learned that some time ago from the writings of Olorin. And who, pray, is Olorin? Asked Peppercorn, keen to learn more of the old man's magic. Olorin was accounted wisest of the Maiar. Now he was a wizard, called by some Mithrandir, by others Stormcrow or Gandalf the Grey. He was a servant of the secret fire, the flame of Anor. It is a fire that lives in all things, Peppercorn, and I simply called it forth, that is all. And that does not make you a wizard? Asked Peppercorn. I'm sure you would agree one does not have to be a warrior to handle a sword. You might not do it very well, indeed you might do yourself more harm than good, but still you could wield it. So it is with magic. A key will open a lock, Peppercorn, whichever hand turns it. Can you tell me more of the wizards? Asked the boy plaintively, of Gandalf the Grey and of his brotherhood. Elisanda pursed his lips in thought. His pipe by now had died, and he tapped out the ash against the leg of his stool. It is no great secret, he began, so I suppose it would not hurt to tell you a little. In the Third Age, when Sauron the Great Eye began to grow in influence over the peoples of Middle-earth, the gods sent forth 5 wizards, the Astari, 5 powerful spirits endowed with certain magical gifts, to battle the rising forces of evil and to aid the small folk of Middle-earth in their struggles. You'll have heard their names, I'm sure, if not of their exploits. Gandalf Greyheim I have already mentioned. Then there was the head of their order, Saruman, Lord of Isengard. Like the pipeweed? Peppercorn asked, holding up his own pipe. Like the pipeweed, Elisanda agreed. For there was indeed a very popular variety of leaf smoked in Laketown, called by the name of Saruman's Best. Not that it had anything to do with this Saruman of the tales, nor with Isengard for that matter, but had been named by some enterprising tobacco farmer of Eriador who thought it a good idea to capitalise on the old story of the White Wizard. And then there was Radagast Birdfriend, the maid continued, Alatar the Aftercomer, and Palandro the Distant. Their skills were great and their knowledge greater. I've heard their names, agreed Peppercorn, but know little of their deeds. Their deeds too were great, continued Elisanda, some for good, some for ill, but that is a tale for another time, for there is far more in it than will fill up the hours between now and sunrise. Sadly, the wizards are no more. They are gone, whether to their graves or to the Undying Lands or to Valinor, no one living knows, and their skill and knowledge and magic for the most part have gone with them. But there are many who claim the ability to perform magic, said Peppercorn. The stories are full of them, and their deeds. This much is true, conceded Elisanda, and there are indeed many besides the Istari who have wielded magic. Warlocks, necromancers, sorcerers. There are many names by which they have been known to mankind, and many more that have been forgotten. But call them whate'er you will, there have only ever been two kinds. Those deceivers and fakers who make a pretense of wielding the magical powers of the universe, and those who really do. There are no varieties or branches in between, for there is only the one source, for good or ill. Anything else is a fraud, anything else is but trickery. It does not matter which group they belong, whether wizards of Eru or foul creatures of darkness, nor their purpose in wielding it. They all drink from the same spring. All their miracles and magic are performed by the same power, the power of the Valar, the gift of Eru Ilúvatar. The secret fire? Peppercorn affirmed. Quite so, replied the mage, pleased to see that his pupil was beginning to understand. It is written that Mithrandir, that great wizard of old, could cast fire as if it were a spear, and could hold it in his hands and shape it to his will. Now that is magic, Peppercorn. That is true power. Elisanda sighed, and fell quiet for a moment, contemplating no doubt the power of the ancient wizard. So you see, I am no wizard. I cannot be. I am what the Easterlings called Vizyard, or wizard-kissed, for they believe me favoured of the wizards. Whether that be true or no is neither here nor there, but I am a student of the Istari, a disciple, you might say, self-appointed and self-taught in their religion, a collector of their wisdom and lore. Some might call me a dabbler, and that may be true, but I have learned much in my long years of study, gleaning much of passing interest and much more of value. You see, though the wizards did much during their time on earth, they left little to tell of it. To discover everything I could of them has been my life's labour, and the very devil of a game, I should add. It is many hundreds of years since last they walked Middle-earth, and all that remains of their eminence is fragments and tidbits, morsels and crumbs, a word in a book here, a line on a parchment there. I have travelled throughout Middle-earth, hunted far and wide for knowledge of their ways, scoured the libraries of distant cities, searched out long-forgotten texts, parchments in libraries, ancient vaults and chambers of every kind, there to find anything of the Istari. Such are the knowledge storehouses of Middle-earth. I have read all manner of antiquated scratchings on paper, archaic marks and crumbling ciphers, decaying runes and time-faded scripts. I have studied the writings of the law masters and historians of all the royal cities of men. I have searched the pages of the Epic of Gunda Ross, studied the lyric words of Bodisson the scribe, scoured the omen texts of Bilibad the blind, the Red Book of Westmarch and Maglor's The Fall of the Noldor, endless volumes of manuscripts, quires of pages and codices in all languages both known and forgotten. I have examined, uncovered, scrutinised, inquired, rooted and scoured Middle-earth for any vestige of their wisdom, and now, I wager, there is none living who knows more of the Istari than do I. And I say that not to boast of my knowledge, but to give some little understanding of my determination to learn their ways. And what exactly are you looking for? Asked Peppercorn. Exactly, repeated the mage. Well now, that is hard to say, for it set out as one thing and in the process has become many more. Indeed, it was as I searched these ancient writings and records that I first learnt of the Magic Talisman, which for several years now has been my main concern. It was here also that I first heard of it connected with the fireworm Smorg, of how he had stolen it from the treasure house of Palangan to satisfy his dragon fever. Dragon fever? Asked Peppercorn. An insatiable hunger for gold, Elisanda explained. It is every fire drake's passion. I'm not alone, mind you, the mage added, seeing the serious look that had come upon the boy's countenance. There are others of my persuasion, others who share my interest in the Istari. We are not quite a brotherhood, but we are motivated to the same end, and so we share our knowledge and the burden of watching, of waiting, and looking for the signs. What signs? Asked Peppercorn. Oh, you know, replied the mage, not a little dismissively, this and that. And you believe all that prophecy and sign stuff? Asked the boy, already knowing the answer. My dear Peppercorn, it is easy for us to discount the existence of anything that might dwell outside of the narrow realms of our own experience. Easy to deny the truth of anything that we have not seen with our own eyes, shrinking the world to the narrow confines of our own knowledge and observations. But this is a shallow and dangerous mistake. If we close our minds to certain eventualities, to the reality of certain races of creatures, for instance, and here he gave Peppercorn a knowing look to remind him of his own disbelief, then we will ignore any subsequent evidence of their ever being so. And having discounted their possibility, how then can we hope to resolve problems arising from those we have long denied existence? It is a paradox of our own making, a puzzle that cannot be solved. My advice to you, Peppercorn, is to open your mind, and do not close it simply because of the things you do not understand. Peppercorn knew that what the mage said was correct. After all, hadn't he seen the remains of the dragon with his own eyes? Wasn't that proof of the existence of dragons at least some time in the past? Yet only a matter of days ago, he had refuted and disputed the existence of such a thing. A moment ago you spoke of the flame of Anor, reminded Peppercorn. Is that the Anor of the good men? Does it mean that the temple was right all along? Oh no, assured the mage. Anor is indeed the sun, but that is not the origin of power. The sun was born of the white flame, the light of the trees of Valinor, created by the power of Eru. No, there is more than one meaning of Anor, and in this instance it means Valinor, the place from whence the Valar exercise the power of Eru. He is the god of this world, and he the source of all its magic and wonder. And I do not doubt but we will have need of a good deal more magic before we have your treasure and mine hidden away somewhere safe. And so they continued talking in this way, talking and smoking for an hour or more, and it was as Peppercorn pondered these notions, trying to understand the words of the old man, that the quiet of the night was suddenly and rudely broken by the abrupt and startling sound of a bell being rung. Not any old bell, mind, the bell, the galley bell that Peppercorn had attached by way of a rope to the trapdoor of the hold. Someone was trying to open it. "Galaderin!" cried Elisander in a commanding voice as he jumped to his feet. Immediately the white light burst forth once more from the head of his staff, filling every inch of the small cabin as if it were a storm lantern, blinding Peppercorn with its suddenness, and then spilling out to illuminate the rest of the underchamber until it were like high noon on a midsummer's day. And the light was accompanied by the sound of a longsword being drawn from its scabbard. Peppercorn too was on his feet in an instant and running out onto the deck, gaff in hand, to see three dark figures silhouetted in the glare of Elisander's magic, stooping over the open hatch of the hold. Startled into action, the figures turned and leapt from the deck, over the gunwales and onto the dockside where they hit the walkway running and continued out of the undercroft and into the early morning of the city. Without any thought, Peppercorn leapt after them and gave chase. Beyond the inn's vault, the darkness of night was by now besieged by the growing light of morning, and though it was but a wan light at best, still it was enough for Peppercorn to gain a fleeting impression of the fleeing men. They seemed to be dressed all in black, with short cloaks that flared out behind them, and strange conical hats with pointed crowns, not unlike Elisander's old felt hat, Peppercorn thought, only without the wide brim. He could not make out any features, for their faces were obscured with some kind of covering, a mask or a scarf perhaps, but he did not need to see their faces to know what they were. Thieves, bent on stealing the dragon's treasure. What he had clearly seen, for it is the kind of detail that one notices when encountering intruders in the dark of night, was that they each wore a pair of swords, one long and one short, upon their belts. And so Peppercorn gave chase, charging through the unlit city, tearing after the fleeing men, following them over whichever bridge, up whichever side street, or down whichever alley they chose to lead him. And they ran with purpose, as if their lives depended on it. The wooden landings and walkways were still slick with rainwater and slippery underfoot, and more than once Peppercorn nearly lost his footing and would have ended up in the black water of the lake had he not checked himself. But still he ran on, for he was young and confident of his ability to catch the veiled men. Up passageways and down alleyways they continued, the black forms of the robbers, cloaked in night-time and shadow, with Peppercorn in ever closer pursuit. Soon, both pursuer and pursued were panting heavily. Peppercorn knew the back alleyways and catwalks of Laketown, as well as most and better than many, but running as he was in pursuit of the black-clad men, following wherever they led him, it was not long, running blindly in this way, before he found himself in a part of the weft that he did not know, or at least could not recognise. And it was in this state of disorientation that he finally followed the fleeing figures around a corner, only to find himself at a dead end. A blind alley that passed between two tall buildings, ending after a few yards in the blank wall of a third. And there facing him, with their backs against the end wall, stood two of the dark strangers. Where the third had gone and when he had slipped away, Peppercorn could not say. Face to face as they now were, he was able to see a little better their strange manner of dress, their high leather riding boots, their tall hats and veiled faces. But most noticeable were their drawn swords, long pointed blades that reflected what little dawnlight was beginning to halo the rooftops. It was at this point, confronted as he was with drawn swords, that Peppercorn realised, far too late it would seem, that during all of their chase he had never once given a thought to what he might do if or when he finally caught up with them. It was an important question to have overlooked, for they were 2 in number while he was but 1. They were grown men and larger in stature than he was, not to mention that they were armed with swords of pointed steel, 2 apiece to be exact, while his old fishing gaff was beginning to feel less and less substantial. How he wished at that point that he had taken up the long knife he had taken from the covert instead of the gaff. Now that they confronted him, swords in hand, their backs to the wall, the urgency of that question was brought into stark relief. They were all 3 panting and out of breath after their chase around the weft, and now they each shifted about nervously, each one eyeing the other, each waiting for the other to move. What he was to do now, Peppercorn did not know. "So," said the closest of the figures, breathing heavily through the veil that covered the lower half of her face, for the voice was indeed that of a woman. "You have caught us, boy, like rats in a trap, you might say." "We are at your mercy," added the second in something of a gruff, mocking tone. "What now will you do with us?" Though it had been he that had pursued them, Peppercorn realised that the tables were now turned, and that it was now he that had been caught. What was he to do now? He thought about turning tail and fleeing back into the obscurity of the city, but as if reading his thoughts, the second of the figures moved around and behind him, blocking off his only means of escape, raising the tip of his sword threateningly as if to drive the point home. Though Peppercorn knew nothing of these people, who they were, what they wanted, and what lengths they would go to get it, he knew they meant him no good. He had been a fool to pursue them. "Well?" asked the woman again, inviting him to action, taking a step closer, a sword in each hand. Peppercorn knew what was to come, and he imagined the points of the swords piercing his soft flesh and the agony of the steel blades inside him. What to do? His mind was racing. He could not think clearly. Fear rose like bile. He could see no way out of this, but he was not ready to give up yet. He was strong, he told himself, and he had his gaff and he would go down fighting. He steadied himself and planted his feet firmly in readiness to repel the attack that would surely come. And then a thought came to him, as if from nowhere. What was it Elisandra had said? Gallad Erin, that was it. Back on the farthing when he had filled the undercroft with light, and before the thought had even formed into a plan, he raised the gaff above his head and with both hands brought it down with a thump onto the wet boards, just as he had seen the mage do, and as he did so, he repeated the words he had heard Elisandra speak. "Gallad Erin!" he cried into the darkness. He did not know the meaning of these words, or from which language they hailed, but it did not matter, for a key will open a lock whichever hand turns it, and so it was now. Immediately, light burst forth from the head of the gaff, but not as it had done for Elisandra, for whom the light had grown in all directions like a ball of fire, filling every space and recess and chasing away every shred of darkness. On this occasion, it came as a single column of fire, erupting from the head of the gaff and shooting upward into the Laketown sky, lighting up the walls that enclosed them and the rooftops above. The iron hook of the gaff, seated as it was in the centre of this storm of flames, glowed orange as if it had been heated in a smith's forge. Peppercorn almost dropped it in his surprise, for though his desperation had brought him to try Lysander's magic, he had not expected it to work. Now he could feel the power of the light surging through the wooden stave of the gaff, could feel it resonating in his hands as if it were alive and desperate to be free. Unsure of what they were seeing, and unwilling to tarry long enough to find out, the dark figures gave flight once more, running away into the obscurity of the dawn city, leaving the boy to wrestle with the magical fire as if the gaff were a fishing pole and he was trying to land a whale. This time, Peppercorn did not give chase. He had learned his lesson, and it had only been by some unforeseeable and miraculous happening that he had escaped with his life. He might not be so lucky a second time. For a minute more, the stream of flames continued to pour from the gaff, filling the skies above him with light. And then, without any word from himself, as if the magical fire knew Peppercorn's thoughts, it disappeared, as suddenly as it had appeared, recoiling back into the tip of the gaff like a snake disappearing down a hole. All about fell once more into darkness. Peppercorn realised he was panting still, and he made a conscious effort to calm himself. He touched a tentative finger to the hook of the gaff, which was once again the dull grey colour of iron, and to his further amazement found that it was cold, not even warm, when only seconds before it glowed like a brand. It was then that Peppercorn noticed something lying on the ground. In their haste to escape, one of the veiled figures had dropped one of their short swords. Quickly he retrieved it, tucking it through his belt, and stepped out of the blind alley back onto the boardwalks of the weft. From here it did not take him long to work out where he was, and then to make his way back to the moon in the water. He had so many questions about who the veiled people were and about the magic fire, but they would have to wait until he was with Elisandra again, for who but the mage could answer such questions? "It was a reckless thing you did, Peppercorn," Elisandra chided when he finally arrived back beneath the undercroft. They would have killed you if you had caught them. I did catch them, Peppercorn replied. Or, sort of, he added, when he saw Alisander's look of surprise. 2 of them, at least. Yes, I see, Alisander replied, indicating the thin sword that was tucked still through Peppercorn's belt. Holding out his hand for it, Peppercorn drew it forth and handed it to the old man. Such a blade says a lot about its owner, mused Alisander, turning the weapon over in his hands, while he weighed it and inspected it. It is the sword of a solitary and clandestine man, practised in the art of killing. And do you suppose that was their purpose in coming here? Peppercorn asked. Well, it would appear they meant to draw us away from the farthing, Alisander replied, while this one, and he pointed with the bloody tip of his sword at the body that lay still upon the deck, this one returned, thinking we would have given chase and that he would be alone to make free with the treasure. I wager he was not expecting to find me here and that I gave him the fright of his life. Still, he put up a good fight anyway. Clearly not good enough, muttered Peppercorn, who, though he had seen death before, had never seen a person who had been killed in combat. Nor had he imagined the mage to be the type to inflict death upon another, for he was an old man. True, he'd appeared more than menacing at the covert, but that had been magic, hadn't it? There had been no sword play on that occasion. Wiping the blade of his long sword and returning it to its scabbard, Alisander said, We should not remain here any longer than we need to. This place is not safe, not for the treasure, nor for us. I fear we are in great danger here. But how did they even know we were here? Asked Peppercorn. They knew, and that is all that matters, replied the mage. We will have time for such questions later. For now we need to move, and we need to move quickly. It worked, Alisander, Peppercorn blurted out suddenly. What worked? Asked the mage. Your magic, replied Peppercorn. The staff, the lights, it worked. Yes, Alisander said, a little confused. I know it worked. It was I that did it. He was not quite following the boy and was beginning to worry that perhaps he had taken a knock to the head, for he was making scant sense. No, I mean it worked for me. I did it, the boy explained. I said the words, Galadarian, and it worked. Fire came out of the gaff, and he held it up for the mage to see, though it looked no different than it had before. It's just like it was with the dragon and the treasure. At first I didn't believe you, and then it turns out to be true. Yes, replied Alisander thoughtfully, the penny slowly dropping. Yes, I suppose it does. And though he said no more of it to Peppercorn, he wondered that one so young and unlearned in the ways of the wizards could so readily call upon and wield their power. Peppercorn wasted no more time, and leaving the mage to his musings, he clambered the steps and called the night porter, who was not happy to be disturbed for the second time in a single night. And he had him rouse the boys of his crew, who came down sleepy-eyed and a little confused. What's going on here, then? Demanded Giles, who was usually so very good-natured, but had descended the steps looking dog-tired and irritated. What do you mean by dragging a boy from his bed when they're warm and dry and fast asleep? No time now for explanation, said Alisander, brushing aside the boy's ill humour. By no means placated by the old man's manner, Giles was just about to renew his complaint when he noticed the black-clad body that lay still in a pool of its own blood upon the deck, and suddenly all 5 boys were wide awake and no further explanation was necessary. Without further ado, they were all at their stations and about their work. The farthing was unhitched from its mooring, and Baldwin employed his pole once more for the business of pushing off from the landing and punting the little boat back out from its berth beneath the inn and onto the canal system that threaded through the city. By this time, the morning was a faint blush, creeping above the eastern rooftops towards which Peppercorn now set their faces, steering them toward the postern and the skipper's warehouse. Here they hoped at last to find a warm welcome and safety, sheltered from winds and storm, smugglers, butchers and black-clad assassins alike. As they went, Peppercorn shared with his crew, as best he could, the events that had passed while they slept, for they were each one keen to hear the story. He left out the bit about a column of light erupting from the end of his gaff, for he worried that this was, as yet, a little beyond the comprehension of his friends. Anor knew he understood little of it himself, and he had been there. Still, it was an omission that Alisander noted. Once he had told them all about the veiled figures and produced the short sword that he had stuffed into his belt, well, you can bet there was no sleepy or unwatchful among their number on that particular leg of their journey. Each boy was wide awake and alert, and all eyes were peeled, scouring the darkness should there be lurking any more of the strange veiled men. If it's not black sails, it's black-clad men, said Baldwin in an offhand way as he plied the pole that pushed them through the water, and Alisander couldn't help thinking there was more truth in the boy's observation than he might have thought. It was not a direct route from where they were to the skipper's place. The network of canals that threaded in all directions through Laketown was very complex, and there were many twists and turns between them and their destination. Nevertheless, they made good time. Men in black veils with sharp swords proved to be something of a great motivator. When they finally arrived at the roost, it was Hob, the most trusted of the skipper's hirelings, who opened the gate to them. It was a little unkind perhaps to call Hob a hireling, for though he was indeed a paid hand and acted most nights as gate ward, he lived at the roost and had done so since before Peppercorn had arrived on their doorstep as a baby. He was of an age with the skipper and a trusted adviser and deputy whenever the skipper was abroad on business. Indeed, he alone was trusted with warding the roost in the skipper's absence. In Peppercorn's mind, the roost was a fortress within a city, a safe haven, a stronghold, where the missus ruled, where her word was final and the skipper enforced it. The Laidlaw household, parents, boys and familiars were a force indivisible, and when the skipper strode out, going about the city on errands of business, his boys followed always behind as his escort, his guard and his retinue. The skipper had been no less surprised to find Peppercorn and company once he was roused than at Hob. Though it was not unusual for Peppercorn to call early at the roost, it was never usually before the kitchen stove had been fired, nor before the missus and Hildreth had filled the place with the smell of fresh baking. "We haven't come for breakfast," Peppercorn said, and then he went on to explain all that had passed over the last week that had resulted in their turning up at that immoderate hour. "Well, I'll be," was all the skipper could say once Peppercorn had reached the end of his tale. Indeed, he had said it at various points throughout the narrative. When he told of the dragon and the treasure, for instance, of the mysterious black sail, the veiled men and the storm through which they had travelled to get there, he'd not say, "Well, I'll be," when Peppercorn mentioned Shillabeer in the covert. "Now that's a playing with fire, Pep," the skipper chided solemnly. "But we had no choice, skipper, not if we hoped to hold on to any of our treasure," said the boy. "That's as may be, and this time you seem to have lived to tell the tale, but I wouldn't go a-making a habit of it, Pep, is all I'm saying. He's sort of not to be trusted, and you may well fall foul of him yet." Of course, the skipper agreed to the barrels being stored in his warehouse, though he rarely showed any affection or warmth, for it was not his way. He loved Peppercorn as one of his own, and had a soft spot for his crew. The same could not be said of his feelings toward Elisander. He did not like the look of the mage, or the cut of his jib, as he had put it, did not trust him, and was not happy that Peppercorn was getting himself mixed up in his shady business. Still, the skipper could not have been happier than for this poor young boy, whose short life had been so precarious and hard, to come into his fortune, and so, on those grounds, he had agreed. It did not take so very long to carry the barrels from the farthing into the main storeroom of the roost. Many hands make light work, or so it's been said, and by the time Peppercorn had outlined the events of the past evening, the rest of the household had been roused to the fact that something was up, and had hurriedly dressed and come out onto the landing to lend a hand. Once the task was complete, and the main gates once more closed and barred, Hob and Byram, the second oldest of the Laidlaw boys, were tasked with watching over the gate and the comings and goings upon the landing, lest the veiled men should put in an appearance and come uninvited to the roost. Hinks was given the job of weighing down the bloody body of the black-veiled man with some old iron chain and finding a quiet spot to tumble him out of the boat and into the lake, where they hoped he would remain and be forgotten. There was not much left of what might be deemed night time, and though the boys of the farthing had caught barely 2 hours' sleep at the moon in the water, while Peppercorn himself hadn't managed even that, the sun was crowning the eastern horizon. So it was decided they would all gather around the big table in the missus' kitchen and have breakfast together, which on this particular morning just happened to be sweet hot oatmeal and fresh bread and butter. A fair exchange, Baldwin resolved, for having been robbed of their night in a comfy bed. And though the skipper was still a little vexed and uneasy at the manner of their arrival at the roost, and at their unlikely tales of dragons and treasure, the missus was never happier than when she had a full house and hungry mouths to feed. And though on this occasion it was a little fuller than even she was used to, she and Hildreth set about the task with admirable zeal. And the skipper was never happier than when his missus was happy.